In response to the environmental, food security, and economic crises facing civilization, analysts tend to offer solutions that fall into one or more of four categories:
modernism and the demographic transition, economic growth and development, technological innovation, and a paradigmatic shift in consciousness. In this series, I will deconstruct these proposed solutions and examine their shortcomings. Part 1 reviews the human predicament. We will find that because civilization's 5 major institutions offer superficial analyses of humanity's crises, their proposed solutions have been and will continue to be ineffective. Before we examine the solutions proposed, let's first review the twin crises, the destruction of our planetary home and the sustainability of civilization. Humanity's growing crises have 2 basic legs: the population explosion and the consumption explosion. This iconic diagram of the population explosion, or the exponential growth of human numbers, exemplifies the accelerating pace of the human predicament. Shaded areas in this diagram represent population in 50-year increments. The total population in the second half of the 20th century was twice that of the first half of the 20th century. It was in this period, approximately 1950 to 2000, that destruction to forest, wildlife, farmland, water resources, fossil fuel use, carbon emissions, and all the rest reached crisis levels. By the 1980s, the human footprint had passed a threshold. Each year since, our species has used more of Earth's resources than the Earth can replenish in 1 year. This is, by definition, not sustainable. The total population in the first half of the 21st century is projected to be double the already unsustainable population of the last half-century. Whether the Earth can accommodate even the 9.6 billion people expected to be living in 2050 must be seriously contemplated. We need to understand the full magnitude of our circumstances, not because we want to scare ourselves, but in order to undertake the proper action as individuals and as a collective civilization. In this graph, we see that the consumption of food and all the other material resources has grown far faster than even our population. Consumption grew 5-fold in the 20th century's second half, and is on course to grow 5-fold more in this century's first 50 years. It is, of course, not merely population that determines our impact on the environment, but rather the consumption and pollution of that population. This diagram gives us a clearer sense of why the human crisis has moved so quickly upon us. Exponential change leads to continually surprising results. Faster than scientists can predict, glacial meltwaters flow as ever larger rivers. Fish are disappearing from the oceans. Aquifers drop faster. Farmland turns into deserts, and so on. Projected out into the rest of the century, the blue area between 2050 and 2100 illustrates what economists expect, a yet another 5-fold rise in consumption from the previous half-century. Given the environmental destruction that has already ensued since 1950, this exponential rise in the use of resources seems absurd and completely delusional. However, because there are still so many very poor people in the world, economists and policymakers believe that only by so increasing our economies can such poverty be alleviated. Humanity has bifurcated into 2 distinct groups, the relatively affluent 1.5 billion or so, and the 5.5 billion poor people. So despite all the destruction we have wreaked on the planet to acquire our food and other material needs and desires, it still hasn't been enough to take care of everyone. For decades now, the following numbers have remained stubbornly high. Somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion people suffer the daily pangs of hunger. They do not take in enough calories and enough protein to maintain a healthy weight and provide sufficient energy for daily activities. 9 to 12 million people die of starvation and hunger-related diseases each year. 2 to 3 billion suffer the effects of micronutrient deficiencies. Micronutrients include iron, zinc, vitamin A, and iodine. Without sufficient quantities of these, especially in childhood, a person grows up stunted physically and mentally. They exhibit all sorts of painful and debilitating ailments through life, including blindness, anemia, cancer, and chronic infections and illness. They suffer lifelong symptoms of pain, and they tend to experience early death. Billions suffer from unsanitary conditions and non-potable water. And over 2 billion people live under the $2 poverty line, as determined by the World Bank. That $2 minimum, by the way, many have criticized as being far too low for a healthy existence. When a more appropriate minimum is considered, we find that several billion people live in severe poverty. Most of the people in these statistics are, of course, the same people. Poverty is a heartless condition of a stratified civilization. With 3, 4, 5, 6, and now more than 7 billion people, civilization has already done great damage to the biosphere, and each year has taken more than the Earth can renew. And still there are some 2 to 4 billion people who are chronically unhealthy and who do not receive all the food, water, and shelter that is the birthright of any living creature. Never mind all the necessities now considered due a citizen of civilization, like education, transportation, communication, health services, entertainment, and so forth. And yet we are expecting 9.6 billion people to be living with us on this planet by mid-century, and somewhere between 10 and 11 billion by century's end. So the great human dilemma is this. We haven't sustainably supported even the present population with the plentiful resources available, yet in the coming century there will be far more of us trying to share far fewer resources.